Just by way of quick introductions, my name is Alex Cox. I'm a Director of Product Management here in Security at ServiceNow. And with me as well is Andy Oha as well. Andy, could you introduce yourself?
Hey all, Andy Oja here. I'm a member of our professional services team. So I work with many customers like yourselves deploying all of our SecOps products. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Andy. And I think between, my background as an architect in this product line and the platform, and Andy's background in implementation, gives us a lot of experiences that we can pull together and help share some common tips and tricks. So that's the goal of this session, is to introduce some resources, some best practices, and we're going to run through here. I'll be taking the first chunk, looking specifically at a lot of these resources, both in security operations and in platform itself. And then Andy will be running through some of the best practices and implementation strategies. There will be an open section for Q&A at the end. So we're going to try and run through a lot of content. Andy and I both have a little bit less than 15 minutes to run through our stuff. And then we're hoping to have a Q&A and open discussion in the last 15 minutes of the segment. So just really quick, I think most of us here on this call probably understand the importance of asset reconciliation, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, there's a few really critical benefits that we're going to target here with the features that we're talking about. So one of them is normalization. So the ability to go and, oh, looks like I'm not sharing my webcam. There we go. The ability to talk about the same thing, have that Rosetta Stone between the vulnerability team and the operations team. So if I'm Vinny, the vuln manager, and I want to get something fixed, I can make sure that when I'm asking Izzy and IT Ops to do the work, that we're talking about the same systems, right? Another thing is avoiding human error. So in kind of before going through this asset reconciliation process, I know a lot of us in the past have moved from using things like spreadsheets and other sorts of things. There's a lot of room for human error, so that normalization is super important. Make sure we're all again talking about the same thing. And then in Jonathan's presentation earlier, reporting consistently across teams is pretty important. He was showing that one aspect, but in terms of all kinds of things like measuring your vulnerability posture and making sure that teams understand their individual vulnerability posture. That's really helpful. And of course, everybody knows that that's going to help go faster if we're all speaking the same language. So no need to go into that. Another couple quick things, deduplication of work is pretty huge there too when you start, kind of properly having asset reconciliation happen. So as you guys are aware, the vulnerability scans happen all the time. So you have all kinds of different cadences. You could have one every day. You could have 2 or 3 a week for a given data center or data set. And of course, you want to make sure that you're not doing work over and over again that might just be the same task that's already sitting in the queue, or if there's an exception, that exception should be persistent across the scan findings, right? So these are some of the clear benefits of making sure that asset reconciliation is working, deduplication of work, and also having persistent exceptions. We're going to go into this is going to be somewhat of a technical presentation, but we're going to go into a little bit more depth than what you see here. But being able to augment the CMDB with vulnerability scan data is also important. So I find that the vulnerability scanners, they have this huge purview that can see much more than a lot of discovery scanners that are out there, or discovery scanners that are configured. So it can be really helpful to make sure that when that information is coming in, if it's consistent and managed well and rolled up into a nice bundle that is normalized. And as we see in some later slides, it's not going to trip over some more issues that we'll look at. Then you can start to create new CIs inside the CMDB, start to expand that CMDB or update the CI if needed. Keeping the CMDB fresh is a challenge without a really broad scanners like a vulnerability scanner helping you do the work. So we're going to have 2 sections. One is going to be about Now platform tool sets, and then afterwards it's going to be a little bit about the security operations kind of flows for asset reconciliation at an ingestion point, and then we'll talk about strategies past that as well. So if you haven't seen much about the common service data model, this is an initiative that ServiceNow has to have more consistent processes with the CMDB. So I just wanted to get that out there. If you're following this model, there's a couple downstream benefits. One is you're going to be able to take advantage of other types of reporting inside say the ITSM and other sorts of areas to consistently get out of the box value from things that are created by ServiceNow. If they're looking at they seem to be in certain ways, and they can build more content and reports and things like that for that. So just making sure that you're aware of this. It's something to look into. One particular thing that I'd call out is they've recently added what's called an information object to this. And I think for this particular audience, this is going to be more interesting. This allows you to annotate on a business application that it processes payment card information or person identifiable information or other sorts of, maybe perhaps, company secrets, trademark information, things like that. So an information object is something that I just wanted to make sure that people knew about as a new way to kind of get that logic into the system. For example, with risk calculators, you may want to actually know if an asset is processing that information to be able to increase the risk. A little bit of a tangent from exit reconciliation, but it's about assets, so I thought I'd include that since I thought that was pretty interesting. Really fast, there's a feature called data certification, and I've talked to a lot of people inside ServiceNow and outside of ServiceNow that are not aware of this feature. And this is another way to attack the issue of having incorrect data inside the CMDB. So data certification is a platform feature that my understanding is that all ServiceNow customers will have that if they have the normal ServiceNow platform. And so basically with this, you can take a look at a table, and you can take a look at certain characteristics of that table, and you can assign tasks based on the characteristics of that table. So you're probably wondering where I'm going with this, but in the example earlier with Jonathan, he showed, okay, well, somebody gets assigned a vulnerability to work on, and they're like, well, at that point they got the vulnerability and they're like, this isn't me. What this allows you to do is proactively look at a set of CIs and basically make sure that you ask that owner proactively, is this yours? And more, is it up to date? So this can have downstream impacts to, of course, vulnerability assignment, security incident handling, all kinds of things in IT ops. If you're trying to find somebody to do some work for you to get that patch done, that that could be very helpful. Just a quick visual example of this, right? So let's say you have host ABC that's running database DEF. It's Windows Server 2016. It's Microsoft SQL database. It's in Denver. It's owned by Winnie from the Windows team. So you can have a scheduled task that runs at whatever period that you want, and then basically you can have Winnie review their own data, and Winnie can come back and say, well, actually, we've upgraded this to Windows Server 2019. I don't own it. It's actually the database team. And, it's specifically, Davey from the DB team that's owned it. And actually, you missed a 3 in the IP. This is kind of an extreme example, right? But you kind of get how data certification could be used to task out the refinement and review, just to make sure you have, high integrity CMDB data proactively. So I think when you're attacking this proactively, and then you're also attacking this from, Jonathan's method in the not my asset workflow, you're kind of hitting it from both sides and continually getting better data and having, ultimately less confusion in the vulnerability management process. Spent a lot of time on that, but I think it's definitely worth looking into if you're not familiar with it. So there's also the identification and reconciliation engine for the CMDB. This is another great tool set. So this is more for if you're building something and you're doing something custom and you would like to kind of have a standardized way of ingesting information that's consistent with your other ingestion processes. Just to make sure this is on your radar, the IRE, or identification reconciliation, is very, very helpful for this type of thing. A quick example of how to do this is, from a spreadsheet transform standpoint, you could have a whole bunch of your assets that you want to load into the system, and if you weren't using something like this, you could potentially do things in a way that's not normalized against other CMDB, could create confusion, might be missing some data requirements, things that are like mandatory fields, that everybody as a policy should be putting in. The IRE lets you manage all that stuff, and then also makes it simpler to transform that data, based on pre-existing rule sets that know how to look at IPs, net bios, TNS, things like that, to really help understand that. So I want to make sure that was on your radar as another tool set. Once we dig a little bit into the security operations space itself, I'm going to put the cart before the horse a little bit here. So in ancient history, I was a developer. I'm still a developer at heart. So you get a few kind of code resources first here. But these are things that have helped me in the past. So there are, script includes basically save a lot of information about, and code for how different types of things work, including lookups. So if you're doing something custom, if you're trying to take advantage of like the utilities that come with security operations, there's a couple ones. There's one in particular that I want to call out. But there's a SecOps CI location script include, and there's a function in there. So if you just provide it things like DNS and IP address and FQDN, it can come back and say, I think it's this CI. So for you developers out there in the crowd, hopefully there's at least one or two of you. It's a really useful and quick tip. The IREs, again, for independent, smaller scale lookups, the IRE is probably going to be the most mature way to handle this. But having a quick tool like this is also, in pinch, can be helpful. There are various tools that actually rely on this top one. Just a couple examples here under vulnerability utils. You can pass it a glide record instead of JSON data, or in Qualys, you can do it directly from the import set. But ultimately, all of this kind of rolls back to the SecOps CI location one. So just wanted to get that in front of you for you developers in the audience. Let's take a look at really the meat of this. And this is something that Andy's going to be running through in greater detail. But I wanted to provide the foundation so that, when we're talking about these different things in the data model or the CI lookup rules or the flow, that you understand kind of, what the default state is and what's going on there. Some of these slides may be more detailed than, we can cover it specifically in this presentation, but, we're going to make them available to you. So, if you'd like a copy, just let us know. So from a data model standpoint, of course, there's the CMDB CI, and these can be a whole bunch of different tables that are downstream from this table, but ultimately, this is where we want to save information on assets, their name, IP address, who it's assigned to, et cetera. We're familiar with vulnerable items, which kind of are the records that say, hey, here's the vulnerability that's on there, and here's the CI that has that, or at the very least had the IP or host name or whatever characteristics that are there, depending on if you're using some kind of custom integration, right? There's this thing that basically is in the middle, is this discovered item. So this allows us to have a kind of, again, to overuse the term, a Rosetta Stone between the vulnerable items and the CIs to say, hey, this is the discovered CI, and this is exactly where it's linked. And so that's important to understand that this is kind of it there in the middle, and that's very helpful. This is with the Qualys and Rapid7 integrations where this is used. This particular table. There's a very similar variant of that used in the Tenable integration. It's just developed by a third party, so it's just slightly different. Okay, so that's a little bit on the data model. CI lookup rules define how scan assets are reconciled against the CMDB. So basically, whenever we're doing a vulnerability scan, and maybe it's from one of these different vendors, you can specify, okay, in order, I want to look at if I've got a host name, an FQDN, or I've got this, then this is the highest priority. If I've got that, I'm good. And you can do that at a direct field mapping level. So you can say, okay, if we've got the FQDN and that is the FQDN on the CI is the same, then just go with it. Just go with it. But in other cases, you might want a script. So scripts, basically they use ServiceNow script. You can have, in some cases, 3 or 4 lines or 10-line scripts that actually consider a bunch of different fields and allow you to have conditional logic in there. So this allows you to get really intricate in how you do your CI lookups, this script capability, and a number of them ship out of box as scripts. But I just want to make sure that you know that's there, and that capability, to kind of change how all this works is there. I would just provide a warning that if these scripts are run many, many times, right? So when you ingest vulnerability information, you could potentially, if you write a really slow script that does a whole bunch of lookups, it might have to be run a million times when your scan results come in. So, obviously you would have very tight, efficient scripts if you're going to be doing these types of things. Of course, the out-of-the-box scripts that we've made are as tight as we can make them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the flow. And thank you, Andy, for this slide. This was very helpful. So now that you've got the data model and the rules and under that there, a couple quick things. So as we import third-party data from your scanner, if it's Qualys or whoever, right? As you import that data, we look for the discovered item using that source ID. So there's like the specific ID from the third party. We save that, and in the scan results, if we can always keep that consistent, we do. So that's very important. And so if we've got an existing one, we're good. But if not, we have to use those lookup rules that we just talked about to really find that asset, find the best asset. And it may be that we might not. It may be that there's no good match. So we have to create that unmatched CI record. And so a lot of the stuff that Andy's going to be talking about is unmatched CIs and the strategy for managing those. But finally, if we've already got one, then okay, well, we just create that discovered item record to link the vulnerable item to the existing CMDB record. So that's the flow. I probably, given the amount of time we have, I could probably spend a lot more time talking about this, but I think in the interest of time, we probably want to get to Andy to be able to run through these in greater depth. In the deck, there are going to be, just a few extra notes, very specific, technical notes on some of these things. But I think that none of these are particularly highly important for this particular conversation. There's also in the deck, I've linked several knowledge base articles that help with this process that define this in less simplified but less pretty terms as well. The flowcharts are in black and white and so on. But anyways, I'm going to save these inside the deck for your benefit. There's also a link to the Tenable docs and how they do this. So that's included here in the deck. So with that said, to set the stage, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andy, and I'll let you take it from here, Andy.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, let's jump into some of the strategies we see in the field, common challenges, and just the tools we have to deal with these challenges. They might be useful for you as you look at your environment and things you might bump up against. So to kick this off, let's talk about the happy path, right? So if I have an asset from a third-party scanner, I bring that into the ServiceNow CMDB, and I say, hey, do you have a home for this? The happy path, here's an example of a Windows server. We have one, Windows server, right? It's very unique. There aren't any duplicates. In this case, we may have an attached network adapter. We may have an IP address attached to that, or you may have, all the IP information living directly on the server itself. You also may have this server living as part of a business service in the CMDB. And typically what that would offer us is some flavor of business criticality, right? Is this a crown jewel for my organization? Or, is this the cafeteria lunch menu? In some cases, you may also have custom attributes that your CMDB team has introduced on CIs. So you may not have a business service telling you this information, but you may have an attribute like criticality, live directly on the CI. But in essence, it's a unique CI, and we don't really have to sort through 10 different Apollo 01 servers to find the one we need. There's one unique host. On the flip side, if you could, when we're looking at how we match, there are different types of scenarios for matching. Often we say, just because you match to a CI, that doesn't mean you got to win, right? So if we take a look at that green box there, call this a complete match, and this is sort of that happy path where we've matched to a unique CI, and on top of that, it has all the information we need, selfishly for vulnerability response purposes here, in the sense of, we have the details to prioritize vulnerable items for this CI, and we also have, who owns this, right, from a reporting perspective, who owns this risk to the company, and also, who's in charge of being hands-on keyboard to remediate this vulnerability. The second flavor of matched, we call this sometimes incomplete. So we may have matched to a CI. It could have been a unique CI, but it doesn't have the data that we need to support our activities, right? It may not have any prioritization information, business criticality. It may not have assignment data. The third flavor, this is the tricky one. We may match to a CI, but perhaps it's the incorrect CI. It's not the appropriate CI. And often this comes with, wrinkles such as if there's duplicates in the CMDB, if there's orphaned low-level CIs, such as a network adapter or an IP address. And of course, the last one here is if there's no matched, right? We would in turn create an unmatched CI. So if you go a little bit deeper into the challenges we see here, and we have some visuals to kind of represent this. The first one, we keep mentioning duplicate CIs. You could almost slice this two ways. You may potentially see duplicates within the same CI class. So for example, in your Windows Server class, you may have 5 of the same Windows servers. But then you may also run into duplicates across multiple CI classes. For example, you could have a website, a DNS CI, a server CI, all with the same attributes, right? So these are spread across different classes. That's a bit of the flavor you see in the first screenshot. The second challenge is often around orphaned, what we call low-level devices. These are typically going to be the network adapters or the IP addresses. And you see an example in the second screenshot of a network adapter CI, but it's not actually tied to a server, right? It's not actually tied to a typical CI that we'd want to leverage. And the third challenge is we may have a CI, as we mentioned, without the data we selfishly need, right? Who owns this? Who's responsible for mitigating vulnerabilities on this? What does this thing actually do for our company, right? How important is it? So let's jump into some of the tools we have to sort of help with tuning, and it's in particular our CI lookup rules. So the first tool we have, this is often a really good tool. This was released in version 9 of Vulnerability Response, and it's the ability to specify one or more CI classes that we want to exclude in our lookup rules, right? So essentially, we reduce potentially the noise that we may match to. In the screenshots, you see an example where we matched to a network adapter, and you can see we matched, based on a MAC address. But when you look at that network adapter, it's not tied to a CI. And if you think about it, who really owns a network adapter in my company, right? Do I really want to have vulnerable items tied to a network adapter? Who would I assign that to? Some other examples of where you want to potentially look at are classes such as certificates, DNS records. Sometimes we have customers where their CMDB team has created like a custom virtualization class, and often we see there are duplicates in that path as well. So the ability to just simply say, hey, I don't want to match to anything, in these classes. We often find it useful for tackling the duplicate CIs, for tackling, orphaned CIs, and sometimes even, incorrect CIs. The next tool we have, and this one seems simple when you read it, but it actually is a good tool. So being able to control the span of our searches, right? So if you think of these CI lookup rules, in essence, these are almost searches that we're conducting. And for some of these searches, if you think about it, do you really need to search the entire CMDB, right? So if I have an asset from my scanner, So I really need to search all the CI classes. And what you may find is if you do some initial analysis and you see, wow, we're up against duplicates, we're up against orphans, incorrects, all the stuff we talked about here. One of the quick wins here is actually limiting the scope. So you may say, hey, if I've got a MAC address or an IP address, maybe I limit that to these classes. If I'm coming in with FQDN, maybe my first rule, as Alex mentioned, these are ordered. Maybe my first rule is FQDN on the server class, right? And by nature of that, any class that extends server. The next tool we have, again, this is backing on to that concept of enhancing our queries. If I'm searching the CMDB through the CI lookup rules, and there's 10 potential targets, what we essentially do is we pick the first one, right? So what you can do is you can influence that. So you might say, okay, I get it, our CMDB is dirty, but I know that I probably want to pick the one most recently updated. I don't want the one last touched, 5 years ago, right? You can actually start to influence your queries, and one of the cool things you can do is you could insert a sort by, and you can use a particular date. That way you're sort of forcing the system to surface up what's relevant first, rather than just picking one of the arbitrary, 10 targets. You can also start to specify, if there's duplicates, well, I know, don't give me the ones that we matched on IP, but there's no name, there's no support group. If I match to one of the 10 duplicates, well, don't give me ones that are retired, right? Give me the ones that are operational. So this is another cool tool we have to really tackle potentially duplicates, incompletes, and also the orphan scenario. This one is interesting. Alex mentioned the IRE, identification and reconciliation engine. This is actually one of the techniques they use, and they call this a hybrid rule. So when you look at our CI lookup rules, you'll see typically we take a value, IP address, MAC address, FQDN, and we go do our searches based on that. But you may find it helpful to actually come up with a hybrid, where you say, you know what, don't just match on IP. I actually want to stitch together IP and MAC address. And this way I eliminate matching to some of the potential noise. This capability was introduced in version 10. And specifically, if you look at that script at the top right, you'll see source payload. So in version 10, the ability to actually hit any field is fair game on the source payload. Now you can start to combine and make these hybrid type of CI lookup rules. This one is a really neat one. And we have just some quick tips that might be handy for you as you're working in your environment here. Let's go to the first one. Some of the baseline CI lookup rules, there's a few moving parts to them. In particular, some of the IP specific ones. There are queries that happen at multiple layers. For example, first we may check the network adapters. We may check the IP addresses. And if we find a match to a network adapter, our preference is really to take the parent server, right? We want to say, oh yeah, we found this NIC or network adapter. Give me the server that's attached to it. If we don't find a match there, then we fall back to saying, okay, I couldn't find any network adapters. As a fallback, let me look at all the servers and search for an IP on the server itself. So where we actually go through the network adapter and walk up, we call that an indirect match. And if I find the IP address directly on the CI, we call that a direct match. And often we find it helpful to split these rules apart, because if I go to my discovered item and it says, hey, you matched on IP, and I'm trying to troubleshoot something, a user says, hey, this isn't mine, I need to go trace my steps back. Well, how did we match? If it says we matched an IP, that's great, but it doesn't really tell me how. Did we match directly on the CI, or did we match indirectly coming through a network adapter? If you split these rules apart, you also get some increased control, because you can say, you know what, our preference is actually to go to the network adapter first, and you may do some surgery on this script to put some special conditions in there. And only if you don't find that, then go search on the CIs. So we often find splitting these apart, they offer better control, and it's also super helpful when you have to come back and say, oh, you matched on IP, well what flavor? And this one, for folks using Qualys or Rapid7, you may see that we don't have the traditional transfer maps and import sets. And it's a little bit hard to simulate data, when you're making changes to your CI lookup rules or you're testing a new scenario. For some of the folks using Tenable, you still have that luxury. You can just play with the import sets and simulate your data quickly. Well, if we don't have the import sets, one of the cool things you can do is actually grab a copy of one of the XML files from the data sources. And in there, you can do some surgery. You can take one of these hosts, swap out the IP, swap out the MAC address, swap out the host name, and bring it back into ServiceNow. And this allows you to quickly play with your data, play with your rules, and really do some tight testing.